The intervention was entirely my mother's idea. A mandatory family summit at Uncle Richard's place. Her text had arrived that Thursday morning. "We need to talk about your future, sweetheart." I knew exactly what that meant. It signaled yet another tribunal, where my highly accomplished relatives would assemble to dissect my disappointing life choices, offering condescending roadmaps to get me back on track. These grim interventions had become a quarterly tradition ever since I walked away from my corporate consulting career 3 years ago. Uncle Richard's estate in Bellevue was the ultimate venue for these high-minded interrogations, a sprawling, ultra-modern mansion that practically screamed entrepreneurial triumph. With its floor-to-ceiling glass walls, sterile minimalist decor, and a panoramic view of Lake Washington that likely cost more than most people's entire mortgages, it served a distinct purpose. It was a physical manifestation designed to remind everyone in attendance that Richard had built something monumentally meaningful. While others had not, I arrived precisely on time, clutching a $12 bottle of grocery store wine. The jury had already convened. Mom, Dad, Aunt Susan, my older brother Michael, and my cousin Jennifer were huddled in the cavernous living room, clinking their expensive drinks. They all wore that strained, painfully awkward expression people reserve for staging an intervention. "Jessica." Richard boomed the moment I stepped inside, his voice radiating engineered warmth. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing your situation." My situation. That was the collective family euphemism for my absolute lack of traditional success markers at age 31. In their eyes, I had no corporate title, no prestigious salary, and no discernible upward trajectory. I merely had a modest, part-time bookkeeping gig for local small businesses and what they all assumed was a rapidly depleting bank account. Sit, Richard urged, grandly gesturing toward a lone, isolated chair positioned directly opposite the family firing squad. "We only want to help you." I took my seat and accepted the glass of wine Jennifer poured for me. "That's incredibly kind of you all." "Now," Richard said, leaning back and seamlessly adopting his practiced leadership persona. "We've been talking, Jess, and we collectively think it's time for some tough love." Michael leaned forward, eager to spearhead the attack. "Jess, you're 31 years old. You can't just keep drifting through life forever." "Your brother is right," Dad chimed in, sounding weary. "When I was your age, I already owned the hardware store, carried a mortgage, and had 2 kids to feed. You need stability." Aunt Susan nodded with performative sympathy. "Sweetheart, we're just terrified for you. Living in that cramped little apartment, scraping by on part-time jobs, with absolutely no retirement savings. What happens to you when you get older?" I took a slow sip of my cheap wine and waited for Richard to seize center stage. This was always his show, after all. "The thing is, Jessica," Richard said, steepling his fingers in his leather armchair, "success doesn't just happen by accident. It demands rigid discipline, relentless vision, and grueling hard work. I certainly didn't build TechFlow Solutions by taking the easy way out." TechFlow Solutions was Richard's enterprise software company, a venture that had grown from a humble garage startup into a dominant industry player. It was the shiny crown jewel he had used as the ultimate case study for his lectures on entrepreneurial excellence over the last 4 years. "Richard is absolutely right," Mom said, gazing at her brother with immense pride. "Look at what he's accomplished. He built a $100 million company from nothing." "Actually," Richard corrected, his face tightening with a veneer of false modesty, "our latest internal valuation actually puts us much closer to $300 million. The living room buzzed with the mandatory corporate reverence. Richard had undeniably built a titan, and everyone knew the stakes. TechFlow Solutions now employed over 400 people, occupied offices across 5 major cities, and Wall Street was already whispering about an upcoming IPO. "The core point, Jessica," Richard pressed on, "is that true entrepreneurs don't rely on handouts. We bootstrap ourselves from the mud. We take massive risks. We happily sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term legacy." Jennifer nodded like a bobblehead. Uncle Richard is just so inspiring. He's living proof that with enough dedication, anyone can build a meaningful life. Exactly right, Jen, Richard said approvingly. Which brings us right back to you, Jessica. Here it comes. I steeled myself. I've been giving your situation a lot of thought, and I'm prepared to make you a serious proposal. TechFlow is currently expanding our internal accounting division. I could carve out a secure position for you. Excellent salary, comprehensive health benefits, and a structured advancement track. It will finally give you the foundation you need to start building a real future. The cavernous room fell dead silent, eagerly awaiting my gratitude on paper. It was an incredibly magnanimous gesture from a highly successful titan attempting to rescue his floundering, aimless niece. That is exceptionally generous of you, Richard, but, Michael interrupted, instantly sensing my hesitation. Jess, you are in no position to be picky about corporate fit. You desperately need a real income. Your brother's right. Dad doubled down. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride and take jobs you don't love to eventually earn the ones you do. The fundamental issue, Jessica, Richard said, officially shifting into full keynote speaker mode, is that you've never experienced the raw discipline of entrepreneurship. Real visionaries understand that success demands brutal sacrifice. We don't possess the luxury of only working when we feel passionately inspired. Richard built TechFlow by pulling 18-hour days for 3 straight years, Aunt Susan added defensively. No weekends, no vacations. Just pure, unadulterated dedication. That's the defining line between entrepreneurs and mere employees, Richard lectured. Employees mistakenly believe someone owes them a paycheck just for showing up. Entrepreneurs understand that you are only ever compensated for the tangible value you create. I nodded slowly, looking appropriately contemplative. That makes a lot of sense. The harsh, unvarnished reality, Richard continued, visibly warming to his favorite sermon, is that most people simply aren't cut out for entrepreneurship. They crave the lavish rewards without ever taking the risks. They want someone else to shoulder the security while they comfortably pursue their little hobbies. Like working part-time at boutique nonprofits, Jennifer volunteered helpfully. Precisely. Look, Jessica, there's no shame in being an ordinary employee. Most people require the rigid structure of a traditional corporate environment. The real problem arises when people masquerade as independent minds while still subtly expecting handouts. Handouts? I asked, tilting my head. Financial safety nets from family, government subsidies? Loans they have no intention of repaying? Anything that allows them to dodge the real-world consequences of their stagnation. True entrepreneurs never need handouts. We bootstrap ourselves. The room murmured in solemn agreement. Richard's capitalist manifesto was compelling, backed by undeniable real-world victory. He had willed a massive enterprise into existence through sheer grit and business acumen. The ultimate question, Jessica, Richard concluded, is whether you are finally ready to stop expecting handouts and start building a real life. I think I finally understand, I said quietly. Splendid. So you'll formally accept the TechFlow position? I will definitely give it the consideration it deserves. Richard smiled magnanimously. Excellent. I'll have our HR director draft an official offer letter. We can start you at an $85,000 base, which I imagine is substantially more than you've ever made. In truth, my personal investment income from the previous fiscal year had hovered right around $47 million. But I decided this wasn't quite the tactical moment to shatter the illusion. That's very generous, I murmured instead. It's not generosity, Richard corrected sharply. It's opportunity. I'm handing you a rare chance to prove your worth in a high-stakes corporate environment. The interrogation droned on for another grueling hour, with various relatives chipping in advice on strict budgeting, career metrics, and fiscal responsibility. Richard shared several more parables about birthing TechFlow, heavy on themes of self-reliance. I listened politely, tossing out occasional questions that allowed him to expand on his legend. By the night's end, the family seemed universally satisfied that they had successfully set me straight. I hugged them all goodbye and drove back to my small, quiet apartment in Capitol Hill. Once safely inside, I poured myself a glass of wine, a vintage significantly better than the grocery store bottle I'd left at the mansion, and opened my laptop. Richard's sermon on pure, bootstrap entrepreneurship was incredibly amusing, considering TechFlow Solutions had been erected entirely on mountains of anonymous venture capital. According to the private financial ledgers I audited regularly, TechFlow had aggressively raised capital through 3 distinct funding rounds over the last 4 years. Their initial seed round had provided a vital $8 million. Series A had injected another $35 million. Their recent Series B had secured a staggering $150 million, bringing the total outside investment to exactly $193 million. The lead institutional investor anchoring all 3 rounds was Cascade Ventures, a private equity firm specializing in enterprise tech. Cascade provided the lifeblood of TechFlow's scaling operations, holding a commanding 67% controlling stake in the entity. What Richard remained blissfully ignorant of was that Cascade Ventures was a wholly owned subsidiary of Pacific Capital, which was managed by Meridian Holdings, which was entirely controlled by a private asset trust I had personally established 6 years ago. I was Richard's anonymous savior. I was the singular source of the $193 million that had constructed his magnificent entrepreneurial empire. The irony was absolute poetry. Richard's entire identity was anchored to self-reliance and bootstrapping, yet his enterprise was utterly dependent on outside institutional capital that he believed originated from faceless corporate boards. In reality, every single dollar powering TechFlow Solutions flowed directly from me, the very relative he had just spent his evening lecturing about handouts. I had first flagged TechFlow during their seed phase, back when Richard was desperately pitching his software concept to skeptical venture capital firms. His tech architecture was undeniably solid. His market analysis was flawless, and the scalability was obvious. The fact that he was my uncle had made me more cautious, not less. I forced my team to conduct ruthless due diligence before cutting the check. But as TechFlow expanded and Richard's family lectures grew increasingly insufferable, the investment had taken on a dark, satirical character. Richard had been comfortably successful before TechFlow, having sold a previous firm for $30 million, plenty to retire on. But TechFlow had elevated him to the stratosphere of wealth, and that wealth had amplified his natural arrogance. The bootstraps speeches had truly weaponized about 2 years ago, always delivered with the supreme unearned confidence of a self-made god. Richard genuinely believed he had conquered the tech world through pure grit, completely blind to the fact that every strategic move he made was financed by my checkbook. I logged into my secure terminal and drafted an encrypted message to my principal wealth management team at Pacific Capital. Please schedule an immediate briefing regarding TechFlow Solutions. I am reviewing structural changes to our current position. The confirmation popped up in under an hour. Available tomorrow at your earliest convenience. Current exposure is $193 M across 3 tranches. Portfolio metrics remain strong per Q2 filings. Awaiting strategic directive, I booked the call for 2:00 p.m. and spent the rest of the night auditing TechFlow's balance sheets. Purely as an asset, the company was thriving. Revenue growth was linear. Margins were optimizing, and they were successfully starving out competitors. Richard was, objectively speaking, a highly competent CEO. He executed smart strategies, recruited top-tier talent, and built genuine enterprise value. The fact that he used that success to demean his family was an irritating personality flaw, entirely separate from his corporate execution.
The next afternoon, my encrypted line rang. "Miss Chin." Patricia Williams greeted me smoothly. "Thank you for the time. I understand we are reviewing TechFlow Solutions. I am considering liquidating our entire position," I stated calmly. "The full $193 million. There was a pregnant pause on the line. May I inquire as to the catalyst? Are we looking at strategic misalignment or philosophical differences regarding corporate governance? Regarding the fundamental source of their success, I replied. The CEO has been making public assertions regarding self-reliance and bootstrapping that are dangerously inconsistent with the reality of their capital structure. Ah, Patricia said, choosing her words with extreme corporate precision. Personal friction with family founders can introduce unique variables to an investment thesis. What would a forced liquidation entail? Walk me through the mechanics. We have two primary levers. We could quietly shop our secondary blocks to another institutional buyer. Though offloading $193 million in private shares would take time. Alternatively, we can legally exercise our standard liquidation preferences under the original shareholder covenant, demanding an immediate clawback of our invested principal plus accrued priority dividends. Given TechFlow's current cash reserves and outstanding debt liabilities, they would be fundamentally incapable of meeting that demand. Which means involuntary bankruptcy almost instantly. They are highly profitable on paper, but they lack the liquid cash to survive a sudden $193 million capital call. They would be forced to scramble for toxic bridge loans or face total asset liquidation. And what happens to Richard's personal exposure? Patricia clicked through her files. Mr. Peterson has executed personal guarantees tied to roughly $25 million of the company's senior debt lines. Furthermore, his remaining equity stake, currently valued at roughly $98 million, would be entirely wiped out. So he would plummet from a multimillionaire founder to personal insolvency, indubitably. I thanked Patricia and informed her I would deliver my final sign-off shortly. The cold, analytical portion of my brain knew this was an irrational financial move. TechFlow was a stellar asset with a bright future. Richard might be a pompous bore, but he had built a real ecosystem employing hundreds of innocent people. Destroying the company to bruise his ego would inflict massive collateral damage. But the emotional human side of me was completely exhausted from being lectured about handouts by a man whose entire legacy was floating on my charity. Later that evening, Richard's name flashed on my phone. "Jessica," he boomed, "just following up on our chat from last night. Have you given any more thought to joining the TechFlow family?" "I have," I said evenly. "It's certainly an impactful offer." "I'm thrilled to hear it. When can we have HR set your start date?" "Actually, Richard, I had a quick question regarding your philosophy on bootstrap entrepreneurship." "Oh, fire away." "Well, you heavily emphasized that real visionaries never rely on handouts, that they build everything from the ground up. I was just curious how that philosophy squares with TechFlow's actual capital structure." Richard let out a patronizing chuckle. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, didn't you raise massive amounts of outside investment?" I recall reading that TechFlow was heavily capitalized by venture capital firms. Richard laughed again, louder this time. "Jessica, that is entirely different. That is sophisticated, strategic institutional capital from professional market makers. That isn't a handout. That's a corporate partnership." "I see. So absorbing hundreds of millions from investors doesn't conflict with your bootstrapping ideology?" "Not even remotely. Investors allocate capital strictly in exchange for equity stakes and aggressive financial returns. They are betting heavily on my personal vision and operational execution. Handouts are just unearned charity with zero accountability. The two concepts aren't even in the same universe. That's a fascinating distinction. Exactly how much outside capital did TechFlow require?" "I typically don't discuss confidential cap tables, but we've raised roughly $200 million across our various funding tranches." "Incredible," I mused. "And these investors just blindly bought into your dream?" "Absolutely not. They subjected us to brutal, exhaustive due diligence. They audited our proprietary tech, our addressable market, our unit economics, and my executive team. They didn't just hand us money out of the goodness of their hearts. It was a calculated, cold-blooded risk based entirely on our performance metrics. So they expect a full return on that $200 million. Of course they do. That is the foundational bedrock of venture capital. They provide the fuel, we build the value, and everyone wins. And if the company suddenly failed to return that capital, then we would face severe, catastrophic consequences. Institutional investors hold massive liquidation preferences, board control, and sweeping covenant rights. It's not like borrowing pocket change from your parents. These are high-stakes, ruthless business alliances with absolute real-world accountability. I see. So your empire isn't actually bootstrapped at all. It was built entirely on a foundation of outside money. Jessica, you're missing the point entirely, Richard said, his tone sharpening with irritation. Bootstrapping doesn't mean you reject growth capital. It means you don't rely on personal handouts or expect other people to subsidize your lifestyle while you figure your life out. But isn't accepting a $200 million financial safety net technically the ultimate form of other people subsidizing your business while you figure things out? The line went completely quiet for a beat. When Richard spoke again, his voice was laced with condescension. That is an incredibly naive, uneducated way to look at high finance. How should I look at it then? Investment capital arrives with heavy strings attached. Strict fiduciary duty, intense performance metrics, and massive legal accountability. The board isn't gifting me a lifestyle. They are gambling on my specific ability to generate a massive return. If I fail, I lose absolutely everything. And if you succeed, everyone profits. The fund gets their return, you secure your wealth, and the market thrives. It sounds beautiful. Exactly, Richard said. Vindicated. That is the beauty of free market capitalism. So, do we have a deal on the job? Actually, Richard, I have a small confession to make. A confession? About what? I am your investor. Richard paused, then let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. Jessica, that's literally impossible. Why is it impossible? Because our capital partners are elite. Multi-billion-dollar institutional funds with massive assets under management. You work a part-time bookkeeping gig. Where on earth would you get that kind of capital? What if I told you I have alternative revenue streams? Then I'd ask, what possible revenue streams could grant a part-time bookkeeper backdoor access to top-tier private equity syndicates? The kind of streams generated by managing a personal $2.8 billion diversified investment portfolio through an array of private holding companies and offshore trusts.
The line went dead silent. Jessica, Richard finally said, his voice dropping an octave. This isn't funny. I'm not joking, Richard. I am telling you explicitly that Cascade Ventures, your majority stakeholder, is a shell entity entirely controlled by parent companies that I own. That is absurd. It's impossible. Why? Because I choose to live in a modest studio apartment and drive a 15-year-old Corolla. You like playing small, Richard stammered. Jessica, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars here. 193 million, to be completely precise, spread neatly across your seed round, Series A, and your recent Series B. How could you even pull that off? A Stanford MBA? Highly lucrative early-stage positions in several tech startups that achieved massive IPOs and 6 years of aggressive algorithmic reinvestment. It's actually quite straightforward math. But you work part-time. You claimed you couldn't even afford to split Mom's birthday gift last month. I adhere to a very strict personal liquidity budget. The $500 for Mom's gift fell outside my allocated personal expense allowance for that quarter. I don't commingle my asset portfolio with my daily checking account. Jessica, if this is actually true, if you're telling the truth, why didn't you ever say anything? Why keep us in the dark? Why would I ruin the performance? You were always so profoundly proud of your self-made, bootstrapped narrative. I had no desire to shatter your sense of personal accomplishment. But you just couldn't help yourself. You let the whole family treat you like an aimless charity case. Richard's breath hitched.
Jessica, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea if you had known what. I cut him off. My voice turning ice cold. If you had known I was the billionaire holding your leash, would you have treated me with basic human respect? Would you have spared me the condescending lectures? Well, obviously, it changes the entire dynamic. It puts everything into perspective. What kind of perspective, Richard? If I possess a massive net worth, I am suddenly exempt from your moral judgments. But if I were actually a struggling, ordinary 31-year-old woman trying to find her footing, I would apparently deserve to be publicly humiliated at Sunday dinner. Is that the lesson? That's not fair. I was genuinely trying to help you. You were trying to assert dominance over someone you perceived as a failure. Now that the power dynamic has inverted, suddenly your tough love manifesto evaporates. I don't need your help anymore, Richard. Jessica, please. I don't even know what to say. Then allow me to speak. First thing tomorrow morning, Cascade Ventures will formally execute its legal liquidation preferences, demanding an immediate total recall of our invested capital. Richard's voice cracked into an absolute panic. Jessica, no! Please, God, no! You can't do that to me. Why shouldn't I? It is my capital, after all. According to your own flawless free market philosophy, I am completely entitled to make cold, calculated, strategic decisions regarding my assets without worrying about unearned handouts for others. This is completely different. That will utterly annihilate the company. It will liquidate an enterprise that was built entirely on what you define as unearned handouts from a family member you look down upon. Jessica, I am begging you, please, don't do this. Are you asking me for a handout, Richard? I'm asking for family consideration? He whispered hoarsely. For mercy, the exact same family consideration you afforded me while branding me an embarrassing lazy failure who relies on charity. I was wrong. Richard choked out, his arrogance completely shattered. I was entirely, profoundly wrong about you. You were wrong about my balance sheet, I corrected coldly. But tell me, were you wrong about your philosophy? Do you still believe that true entrepreneurs never need handouts? Or do you now believe that unearned charity is perfectly acceptable, so long as it comes from a niece who holds your entire life in her hands? Richard offered no reply. The silence on the line was deafening. I'll take that as your final answer, I said smoothly. The legal liquidation filings will hit your desk at 9 a.m. sharp. I hung up the phone. Within 2 hours, my device was practically melting from an onslaught of frantic calls and texts from the rest of the family. Mom, Dad, Michael, Jennifer. Richard had clearly made his desperate rounds, and now they were all panicking, begging to understand the sudden seismic shift in reality. I ignored them all, letting the notifications slide silently into voicemail. I opened my laptop one last time and authorized the final digital signature for Patricia's team. By Monday morning, TechFlow Solutions would plunge headfirst into an artificial liquidity crisis that would systematically dismantle Richard's beautifully fabricated bootstrapping empire. The dazzling $300 million valuation would vanish into thin air, taking his self-made reputation straight down with it. And as for me, I would quietly return to my part-time bookkeeping job on Tuesday. I genuinely enjoyed helping local small business owners organize their books, and my lifestyle suited me perfectly. The only difference now was that Richard would spend the rest of his life knowing that his grand sermon on handouts had been delivered to the very person who had been writing his checks all along. Just as I had discussed with Patricia, the dominoes would fall exactly as I had orchestrated.
Thank you all for taking the time to watch the entire story of Jessica and her incredible comeback against her arrogant uncle. Lesson learned. True humility is the pinnacle of maturity. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, the car they drive, or the apartment they live in. And most importantly, before lecturing someone about independence, make sure you're not living off their lifeline. Deepest thanks. Thank you for your companionship. Thank you for always being such a wonderful audience.
always listening and offering insightful perspectives in the comments below. Your support is my motivation. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions are the greatest source of energy for me to continue searching for and editing high-quality, dramatic, and humane stories like this. Wishing you all a day full of energy at work and school. Always stay alert, humble, and take control of your life. Just like Jessica. Do you think Jessica's decision to take down the company was entirely justified, or perhaps a bit excessive towards her family?